What happened over Israel was not just another missile drone attack. It was not simply Iran firing weapons and Israel trying to shoot them down. That is the lazy version of the story. That is the version television panels will sell because it is simple, dramatic, and easy to digest. But the real story is much more serious. The real story is that Iran demonstrated something every serious military planner already feared, but very few were willing to say openly: modern air defense can be emptied, not defeated in some heroic Hollywood sense, not destroyed by one miracle weapon, emptied, drained, bankrupted. And when the inventory reaches zero, all the technology, all the funding, all the slogans about invincible defense mean nothing. This is what people need to understand from the beginning. Air defense is not magic, it is logistics, it is ammunition, it is math. It is the number of incoming targets compared to the number of interceptors available to kill them. You can have the most advanced radar in the world. You can have trained operators, layered command systems, American funding, and political confidence. But if the enemy sends enough cheap targets over enough hours, and if every target forces you to spend expensive interceptors, eventually your defensive system reaches the same reality every army in history has faced. You run out. That is the part mainstream coverage will try to avoid. They will talk about interception rates. They will talk about damage control. They will talk about American resupply and Israeli resilience. But the question is not whether Iron Dome can be reloaded tomorrow. Of course it can. The question is what was revealed tonight, and what was revealed cannot be put back into a box. Iran did not merely test Israeli defenses. Iran tested the economic foundation of the entire Western air defense model. And the result should make people in Washington, Tel Aviv, Brussels, Kiev, Taipei, and every NATO planning room extremely uncomfortable. Iran's operation was not designed like a traditional strike. A traditional strike is built around destruction. You pick targets, you fire missiles, you try to damage infrastructure, bases, airfields, command centers, or weapons depots. That is not what this was. This was a saturation exhaustion campaign. The real target was not a building. It was not a runway. It was not even a battery. The real target was the interceptor stockpile. Iran was not trying to prove that one drone could defeat Iron Dome. Iran was trying to prove that enough cheap drones launched in the right sequence could force Iron Dome to spend itself into vulnerability. And that is a very different kind of war. The dangerous thing here is not that drones exist. Everyone knows drones exist. The dangerous thing is that Iran used them with patience, sequencing, and cost discipline. They did not throw everything into the sky at once like amateurs. They did not fire blindly just to create headlines. They structured the attack in waves. They stretched the engagement over hours. They forced repeated decision making inside Israeli command. They created pressure without immediately triggering the full emergency response. That is not chaos, that is planning. The first mistake weak analysts will make is assuming that a massive drone attack is simply about volume. It is not. Volume matters, but timing matters more. If Iran had launched every drone at once, it may have created a spectacular image, but it also would have made the defensive response easier to define. Israel and the United States would have immediately recognized the scale, activated emergency protocols, and rushed resupply as quickly as possible. The defenders would have treated it as a single overwhelming crisis. Iran did something smarter. It created a crisis that looked manageable until it was too late. That is where the operational logic becomes important. A first wave comes in large enough to force serious engagement, but not so large that it immediately appears apocalyptic. Iron Dome fires. Interceptors are spent. Commanders look at the numbers and say, we took a hit, but we are still functional. Then the second wave comes. Different approach angles, different timing, more pressure, more consumption. Now the inventory picture begins to change. But still, the system is working. The story from the outside remains: Israel is intercepting most of the threats. But stay with this, because this is where the official story begins to fall apart. A high interception rate can still be a strategic defeat if the cost of achieving that rate drains the defender faster than the attacker is drained. This is the trap. Iran does not need every drone to hit. Iran does not even need most drones to hit. Iran only needs every drone to force a defensive expenditure. That is the entire logic of exhaustion warfare. A cheap drone becomes dangerous not because it is sophisticated, but because the defender must treat it as a threat. If it is ignored and it hits a sensitive target, the damage may be political, military, or psychological, so the defender fires, but each shot costs money, inventory, and readiness. The drone may be crude, the drone may be slow, the drone may be noisy. That does not matter if the defensive missile used to destroy it is many times more expensive and far harder to replace. This is the battlefield reality that propaganda does not like. Western audiences are trained to respect expensive systems and mock cheap weapons. They see a drone with a small engine and a simple airframe and assume it is primitive. But war does not reward elegance, war rewards effectiveness. A weapon is not judged by how impressive it looks in a brochure, it is judged by what it forces the enemy to do. If a cheap drone forces the enemy to fire a costly interceptor, disrupt command systems, activate radars, expose battery locations, and consume limited stockpiles, then that cheap drone is doing real military work. That is what Iran understood. And this is where the intelligence picture becomes much darker. To run an exhaustion campaign, you need more than drones. You need to understand the defender's inventory, engagement doctrine, reload timelines, command behavior, and resupply limitations. You need to know roughly how many interceptors are available, how quickly they are consumed under pressure, how long batteries take to reload, and how long outside support needs to arrive. This is not emotional retaliation. This is intelligence preparation of the battlefield. Iran appears to have treated Israeli air defense as a system with measurable financial and logistical limits. That is exactly how a serious military actor studies an opponent. You do not simply ask, can Iron Dome intercept drones? That is a childish question. The real question is, how many can it intercept before the inventory is degraded? How many before the operators must make choices? How many before resupply becomes necessary? And can we complete the exhaustion cycle before resupply arrives? That is the question Iran answered. Now people will say, but Israel will reload. Yes, that is true. But that response misses the strategic meaning. Reloading the system does not erase the data produced by the engagement. Once a major air defense system is forced to operate under saturation conditions, every observer can learn from it. They can estimate consumption rates. They can study timing. They can identify response patterns. They can calculate how long emergency resupply takes. They can see what kind of attack architecture creates pressure and what kind does not. In other words, the operation becomes a live demonstration. That is why this matters beyond Israel and Iran. This is not just a Middle Eastern event. This is a warning to every country depending on expensive missile defense against cheap mass attack systems. Ukraine faces this problem. Taiwan faces this problem. U.S. bases in the Gulf face this problem. NATO facilities face this problem. Naval task forces face this problem. Anyone who believes expensive interceptors can indefinitely defeat mass-produced cheap drones is ignoring the basic arithmetic of modern war. And arithmetic does not care about political talking points. The Shahed type drone is often mocked because it is simple. That mockery is part of the problem. Simple weapons are not automatically weak weapons. Sometimes simplicity is the advantage. A drone made from common materials with commercial components, a basic engine, and a usable guidance package can be produced in volume. It does not require the same industrial base as a high-end interceptor. It does not require the same rare components. It does not require the same maintenance structure. It does not need to win a beauty contest. It needs to fly far enough, carry enough explosive, and create enough defensive pressure. That is all. The defender, meanwhile, is trapped in a high-cost model. Interceptors require advanced manufacturing, guidance systems, propulsion, quality control, testing, integration, and trained crews. You cannot replace them casually. You cannot mass produce them at the same speed as cheap drones without massive industrial investment. And even then, the cost ratio remains brutal. If the attacker spends tens of thousands per drone and the defender spends hundreds of thousands per interception sequence, the defender may win tactically and still lose strategically. This is the central point. Interception is not victory if the price of interception is unsustainable. That is where Western defense thinking has become dangerously comfortable. For years, officials sold the public the idea that high-tech defense systems could provide reliable protection against hostile missile and drone attacks. They showed interception footage, they cited success percentages, they talked about shields and protection, but they avoided the deeper question: what happens when the enemy designs the attack not to penetrate the shield at first, but to drain the shield until it cannot function? That is not a theoretical question anymore. Iran has now shown the concept in a way that others can study. Hezbollah can study it. The Houthis can study it. Iraqi militias can study it. Russia can study it. China can study it. Every military with access to drone production can study it. The lesson is simple and dangerous. Do not fight the best part of the enemy's defense directly. Make that defense spend itself. Make it work continuously. Make it consume its most expensive ammunition against your cheapest platforms. Make the defender choose between protecting everything and conserving inventory. That choice alone creates strategic stress. And if you think that is the dangerous part, what comes next is even more serious. Once this model is validated, the next campaign does not need to copy it exactly. It can improve it. Future attacks can combine cheap drones with decoys, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, electronic warfare, cyber disruption, and false launch signatures. The drones can force radars active. The decoys can draw fire. The missiles can arrive after inventories are reduced. Electronic warfare can confuse tracking. Small groups can approach from multiple directions. The defender's problem becomes not just interception, but prioritization under uncertainty. That is how modern air defense collapses, not all at once, but through decision overload. A commander under saturation pressure must decide what to shoot, what to ignore, when to conserve interceptors, when to risk impact, when to request resupply, and when to admit that the system is being drained. Every decision has consequences. Fire too much, you run out. Fire too little, something gets through. Wait too long, the political leadership accuses you of failure. Ask for resupply too early, you reveal panic. Ask too late, the inventory may already be gone. Iran's attack exploited that dilemma. The political dimension is just as important. Israel's air defense is not only a military system, it is a psychological system. It gives civilians confidence. It gives politicians room to escalate. It gives the United States a way to justify continued support. It allows decision makers to believe they can absorb retaliation. Once that confidence is shaken, the strategic environment changes. Even if the batteries are reloaded, the myth of endless protection is damaged. That matters because political leaders often make reckless decisions when they believe defensive systems can protect them from consequences. If a state believes it can strike, escalate, assassinate, or provoke while remaining protected behind a technological shield, that belief encourages risk. But if the shield can be drained, then every offensive decision must be recalculated. The question becomes not, can we stop one attack? The question becomes, can we survive a sustained exhaustion campaign if the other side chooses to impose one? That is a very different strategic question. Washington should be paying attention, but Washington has a long record of ignoring battlefield reality until reality becomes impossible to deny. The United States has built foreign policy around expensive systems, alliance guarantees, forward deployments, and the assumption that American logistics can solve any military problem. But logistics is not magic either. Airlift takes time, production takes time. Stockpiles are finite, industrial capacity is limited, and the United States is already stretched across Ukraine, Taiwan, the Middle East, and its own readiness problems. This matters because every interceptor sent to one theater is an interceptor not available somewhere else. Every emergency resupply mission reveals dependence. Every expensive defensive engagement consumes political capital and industrial capacity. The United States cannot indefinitely fund every partner's high-cost defensive model against every adversary's low-cost offensive model. That is not strategy. That is financial attrition disguised as alliance management. And this is exactly the kind of problem Washington hates to discuss, honestly. Officials will say the answer is more funding, more production, more interceptors, more integration, more air defense layers. Some of that may be necessary, but none of it solves the core issue. If the defender remains dependent on firing expensive precision interceptors at cheap, mass-produced drones, the defender remains trapped. You can improve the numbers, but you do not change the economics. You simply raise the cost of staying in the game. The real answer would require a different defensive model: directed energy, electronic warfare, cheaper interceptors, drone on drone systems, hardened facilities, passive defense, redundancy, deception, and a command doctrine that does not treat every cheap drone as a target requiring an expensive missile. But those solutions are not fully mature at scale. They sound good in briefings, they look promising in defense exhibitions, but war does not care about PowerPoint. War cares about what exists in operational numbers when the attack comes. Right now, the cheap drone has outrun the expensive defense model. That is the brutal truth. Now, consider what this means for Hezbollah. Northern Israel is already one of the most sensitive military zones in the region. Hezbollah has spent years studying Israeli systems, building rocket and drone inventories, dispersing launchers, and preparing for a future war that would not look like past conflicts. If Iran has demonstrated that a properly sequenced drone campaign can drain air defense inventory, Hezbollah does not need to imagine the concept anymore. It has a template. That does not mean Hezbollah can simply press a button and reproduce the operation tomorrow. Geography, inventory, intelligence, Israeli adaptation, and U.S. support all matter, but the conceptual barrier has been broken. The question is no longer whether saturation economics can matter. The question is how many actors can adapt the model to their own theater. The Houthis have already shown that relatively low-cost systems can create outsized strategic disruption in the Red Sea. They do not need a navy to threaten shipping. They do not need aircraft carriers. They need missiles, drones, targeting, and the political will to impose cost. That is the lesson of modern asymmetric warfare. You do not match the United States platform for platform. You create problems that force the United States and its partners to spend heavily to defend routine operations. This same logic applies to Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Ukraine, and potentially Taiwan. Cheap systems used intelligently can force expensive responses. That does not mean cheap systems always win. It means the old assumption that wealth and technology automatically dominate the battlefield is no longer reliable. And that is why this event is so significant. The Russia-Ukraine war has already taught similar lessons. Ukraine has used drones creatively. Russia has used drone and missile combinations to pressure Ukrainian air defense. Both sides have learned that air defense is not only about capability, but about inventory management. If you can force the other side to spend Patriot interceptors, NASAMS missiles, Iris-T rounds, or other limited systems against lower-cost targets, you are shaping the battlefield even when you do not destroy the target directly. The same will be studied in Beijing. Taiwan's defense depends heavily on layered systems, American support, and the assumption that resupply and deterrence will hold under pressure. But if a major conflict begins with mass drone saturation, missile salvos, cyber disruption, and electronic warfare, then the same inventory exhaustion problem appears. How many interceptors are available? How fast are they spent? How quickly can they be replaced? Can airfields function? Can command networks stay intact? Can the United States resupply under fire? These are not academic questions. These are the questions that determine whether a defense plan survives first contact with reality. The deeper problem is that Western defense culture often confuses technological superiority with strategic superiority. They are not the same. A more advanced system can still be put into a losing cost exchange. A more sophisticated missile can still be wasted against a cheap decoy. A more expensive aircraft can still be grounded by lack of parts, vulnerable bases, or political hesitation. War is not a laboratory test where the best machine wins. War is a system-level contest involving production, logistics, morale, geography, intelligence, and political will. Iran's operation attacked the system, not the hardware alone, the system. It attacked inventory, it attacked confidence, it attacked assumptions, it attacked the idea that Israeli air defense can always protect strategic freedom of action. It attacked Washington's belief that money and emergency resupply can always stabilize the battlefield. It attacked the media narrative that Western-backed systems are inherently superior because they are expensive and technologically advanced. And this is where the propaganda narrative becomes dangerous. In the coming days, you will hear careful language. You will hear officials say the attack was contained. You will hear that systems performed well. You will hear that losses were limited. You will hear that deterrence remains intact. Some of that may be technically true in a narrow sense, but narrow truth can be used to hide strategic reality. A system can perform well and still expose a fatal vulnerability. Iron Dome may have intercepted many drones. Operators may have done their jobs. Batteries may have functioned under pressure. None of that changes the larger result. If the operation proved that the system can be drained faster, then it can be replenished under certain conditions. That is the issue, not whether Israeli crews are skilled, not whether the technology works. The issue is whether the defense model is sustainable under deliberate mass exhaustion. The answer is now much less comfortable than it was before. And for Washington, this creates a dilemma. If the United States tells the truth, it must admit that the defense architecture it has funded and promoted is vulnerable to cheap mass attack. If it hides the truth, it encourages allies to keep making escalation decisions based on false confidence. Both options are dangerous. But hiding the truth is worse because bad policy built on bad assumptions is how wars expand. That is the warning. Military escalation often begins with leaders believing they control the ladder. They believe they can strike here, signal there, punish one actor, deter another, and manage the public narrative. But war does not obey briefing room logic. The other side gets a vote. The other side adapts. The other side studies your weaknesses. And if your weakness is the economic exhaustion of your defensive inventory, then every future escalation becomes more dangerous than your political class wants to admit. This is especially true in the Middle East, where multiple actors now operate with drone and missile capabilities that did not exist at this scale in previous decades. The region is no longer defined only by conventional air forces and armored formations. It is defined by distributed launch networks, proxy forces, loitering munitions, ballistic missiles, anti ship systems, and cheap drones that can impose real costs on powerful states. That means deterrence is changing. The question is no longer just who has the better aircraft or who has the better missile defense. The question is who can sustain the cost exchange longer. If the attacker can produce cheap threats faster than the defender can produce expensive interceptors, the defender faces a strategic problem that cannot be solved by slogans. This is why Iran's patience matters. They did not need to match Israel or the United States in every category. They needed to identify one vulnerability where their strengths aligned with Western weaknesses: mass production, patience, geographic depth, proxy networks, and willingness to use cheap systems against expensive defenses. That is the asymmetric equation. And when used properly, asymmetry is not weakness, it is strategy. The final point is this: the most dangerous outcome would be for policymakers to learn the wrong lesson. If Washington and Tel Aviv look at this and say, we simply need more interceptors, they will repeat the same mistake. More interceptors may buy time, they may reduce immediate risk, they may be necessary in the short term, but they do not change the fact that the enemy now understands the inventory problem. The better lesson is restraint. The better lesson is that military escalation against a prepared adversary carries costs that cannot always be intercepted. The better lesson is that propaganda about invincible defense creates reckless politics. The better lesson is that air defense must be treated as a finite resource, not a shield behind which leaders can behave irresponsibly. Because the next campaign may not be only drones, it may be drones followed by cruise missiles. It may be drones mixed with decoys. It may come from multiple fronts. It may include cyber disruption. It may target airfields, ports, command centers, power systems, and supply corridors. And if the defender has already been forced to spend heavily in the first hours, the second phase becomes much more dangerous. That is how wars spiral, not because one side plans total war from the beginning, but because each side misreads what the other can absorb. One side believes its defenses will hold, the other side believes it can crack them. Politicians believe messaging can manage the crisis. Military planners believe escalation can be controlled. Intelligence agencies miss the production numbers, the stockpile depth, or the timing of the operation. Media outlets reduce everything to winners and losers. And by the time reality breaks through, the options are worse, the costs are higher, and the path back is harder. That is why this matters. This was not simply about Iran. It was not simply about Israel. It was not simply about drones. It was about the failure of strategic judgment in an era where cheap weapons can impose expensive decisions. It was about the danger of believing your own propaganda. It was about the limits of technology when logistics, cost, and time are working against you. It was about the reality that a defense system can be tactically brilliant and strategically vulnerable at the same time. So when you hear officials say the situation is under control, listen carefully to what they are not saying. They are not saying the cost equation has been fixed. They are not saying the inventory problem has disappeared. They are not saying future attacks cannot be structured more effectively. They are not saying allied stockpiles are unlimited. They are not saying production can keep up with consumption. They are saying what officials always say after a serious vulnerability is exposed: the system worked, the threat was managed, and confidence remains. Confidence is not a military plan. The hard truth is that Iran has forced a new conversation, not with speeches, not with diplomacy, not with threats, with operational data. And operational data is more powerful than political language. It shows what happened under pressure. It shows what was consumed. It shows how long systems lasted. It shows where the defender had to rely on outside support. It shows what future adversaries must calculate. That data now exists. The world's militaries will study it. Some will deny its importance publicly while adjusting quietly behind closed doors. Some will accelerate drone production. Some will demand cheaper defenses. Some will rethink base protection. Some will continue pretending that the old model still works because admitting the truth would be too politically painful. But the battlefield has already moved. The final warning is simple. If leaders in Washington, Tel Aviv, and NATO capitals continue to make policy based on myths of technological invulnerability, they will walk into larger wars with weaker assumptions than they realize. If they confuse interception percentages with strategic success, they will miss the exhaustion problem until it is too late. If they dismiss cheap drones as primitive, they will ignore the cost exchange that is reshaping modern war. And if they keep escalating while pretending air defense can absorb every consequence, they may eventually discover that the most dangerous moment in war is not when the enemy's weapon is advanced. It is when the enemy's weapon is cheap, available, replaceable, and used with patience against a system that cannot afford to keep firing forever.